just for attending a trial to demand justice for a fellow veteran. An elderly black man was dragged out of the courtroom by a police officer, had his nameplate ripped from his chest, and his head slammed into a stone wall until blood splattered. The arrogant officer spat out a cold line. This court isn't for ragged soldiers and colored folks. But what he didn't know was that the old man he had just humiliated was a brigadier general who once led the Pentagon Strategic Response Unit. When real power speaks, how will the arrogant pay for their contempt toward others? Watch until the end to find out. The courtroom was thick with the scent of polished wood, legal ink, and the manufactured authority of justice. Murmurs echoed through the pews, filling the space like static. Then he appeared, Marcus Elijah Colton. Not a man stepping into battle, not a hero demanding spotlight, just a figure in a faded uniform, worn by time, bleached by sun and creased by memory. He didn't speak, didn't look at anyone. He moved like a relic, slipping between shadows, sitting at the very last bench, alone, unnoticed by most, until she saw him. Lieutenant Officer Lasker, skin pale as bleached bone and jaw clenched tight with the smug confidence of unchecked authority, turned mid-aisle. Her gaze latched onto Colton like a hawk sighting prey that dared perch above its station. Something about him, it wasn't loud, but it provoked. That uniform, that stillness, that skin. She walked with purpose, each heel strike a declaration. Jurors went silent. Lawyers turned heads. But Colton didn't flinch, not when her boots scuffed to a stop inches from his feet, not when her shadow swallowed the old light on his face. He just sat there, black, aged, decorated by scars and medals time forgot. "What the hell do you think this is?" she hissed. Not loud enough for the judge, but loud enough for everyone else. Her hand darted forward, fingers closed around the silver nameplate stitched over his heart, its edges dulled by service, but the engraving still legible. Colton M. Eck. She didn't read it, didn't care to. She tore it off with a rip that sounded like bone splitting under weight. The metal hit the floor, the echo sharp, accusing. Colton moved slowly, not with fear, not even with shame, but with something heavier, a dignity wrapped in silence. He reached forward, fingers aged but sure, to retrieve the nameplate, this last proof of a name that had outlasted bullets, bombs, betrayal, and asked when she struck. With all the force of someone who believed herself untouchable, she drove her boot into his shoulder, downward, sideways, full weight behind the heel. It wasn't a kick made for pain, it was made for erasure. Colton's body twisted, balance stolen, head snapping forward as his knee hit the marble step beneath him. His hands didn't even rise to catch himself. His skull cracked the stone with a thud that stilled the room. A thread of blood split down his forehead, crawling toward his brow, then across the ridge of his temple. But even as he collapsed onto the cold floor, one hand still outstretched for the nameplate, his eyes did not drop. He didn't look at her. He didn't look at the stain forming beneath him. He looked ahead, toward the bench, the seal of justice on the wall, the flag that once meant more than paper and pledge. Lasker loomed above him, face twisted, voice now unrestrained, black, old, wearing that tattered excuse for a uniform like it means something. She spat the words. "You think this place is for you? You think you belong here? Get your decrepit ass out of a room meant for people with a future." No one moved. Not the guards by the door, not the clerk typing with robotic precision. The judge didn't bang the gavel. It was as if the whole courtroom froze mid-sentence, suspended between disbelief and complicity. Silence didn't mean absence. It meant permission. Colton stayed down for 3 seconds, no more. His palm closed around the silver plate. He pressed it against his chest, not to reattach but to remember. Blood trickled down his cheek, hot and steady, but he didn't wipe it. He stood, slow and straight. His spine may have creaked, but his gaze never did. He looked at Lasker, and in that look there was no rage, no plea, no fracture, just weight, just clarity. And that silence, that was the first time the courtroom truly heard him. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Lasker opened her mouth again, but this time Her words bounced off a wall of something she didn't understand, an unshakable stillness. Colton stood taller than the flag behind the judge's bench, even though he was the only one bleeding, the only one who'd been on the floor. And still, no one stopped her, no one reprimanded her. The room's inaction was a verdict delivered with apathy. The insult wasn't just in her words. It was in the geometry of power. The white woman in uniform above the black man in a frayed one, boot against chest, body splayed across the seal of American justice. It wasn't a metaphor, it was the message. Colton turned without permission, walked back to the bench as if his shoulder wasn't burning, as if the copper taste of blood wasn't thick on his tongue. He sat again, same spot, last row. The courtroom's energy twisted with discomfort, but no one spoke, not yet. Lasker smirked, not with humor, but with conquest. Her voice slithered through clenched teeth. "You're lucky I don't drag your ass out myself." And in the middle of that war-cracked stillness, Colton spoke. Just 4 words, low and quiet, like an ember about to find oxygen. "I've seen worse boots." She blinked. He didn't elaborate. The courtroom shifted like a fault line about to rupture. A few heads turned. One man in the jury box, a former Marine, judging by the ink on his knuckles, tilted forward. The smirk faded from Lasker's face. She opened her mouth, a retort forming. Then the bailiff entered, completely unaware of the storm he'd just walked into. "Court is now in session," he barked, and just like that the moment passed. But it didn't vanish. It sank deep, etched like a scar beneath the surface of procedure. The judge entered. People stood. Colton didn't. He stayed seated, not in defiance, but because no one who's been shoved onto their knees needs to prove they can rise. He already had. What remained on the marble step, where he had fallen, was a single dot of blood, small but undeniable, a signature drawn in silence, the price paid, again, for sitting in a room that was never meant to include him. He had only just settled back into the same last-row bench, the air still vibrating from the insult that cracked like a whip across marble justice when his voice, soft, almost brushed into existence, cut the silence. What did I do wrong? It wasn't a question posed in weakness. It wasn't an appeal. It was the quiet strike of a match against the flint of injustice, enough to spark something dangerous in someone already used to lighting fires. Lasker's reaction was instant, like venom reacting to warmth. Her eyes flared with the kind of authority that had never been questioned, and didn't intend to start now. Without a word, without a moment's hesitation, she reached for the cuffs on her belt. Her fingers moved fast, polished by practice, but there was nothing mechanical about her motion. This wasn't about protocol, this was punishment. She grabbed his wrist with a snap of steel, twisting it behind his back before anyone had the sense to speak. He didn't resist, not out of fear, but because resistance was beneath him. That fact, his refusal to squirm, only made her more brutal. She shoved him forward, marching him toward the corridor like he was some ragged animal that had wandered where it didn't belong. The courtroom doors slammed behind them, muting the gasps but not the truth. Outside, under the dim hall lights and the sterile shine of tiled walls, she slammed him face first into the cold brick. His aged fingers, weathered by decades of service, curled briefly against the stone before she yanked his other wrist into place. The cuffs snapped shut with the finality of a gavel striking down a name. A high school student stood frozen against the far wall, phone in hand, instinct taking over where courage hesitated. The screen blinked red, camera rolling. Colton didn't flinch. Not at the pressure cutting into his shoulders, not at the concrete biting into his skin, not even when Lasker leaned in close, her breath acidic with disdain. "You people always want a stage," she sneered, the words slow and deliberate, spat like bullets. "Think a uniform means anyone cares what war you dragged it through. This isn't some dusty war museum, old man. This is a courtroom, a future, not your battlefield fantasy." Her voice climbed, rising not out of passion but from a place colder, some dark, hardwired programming that whispered to her that this act of humiliation was not just her right but her duty. She pressed harder, her knee wedging into his spine as the bricks scraped layers off his pride. Blood began to trickle from the reopened cut on his forehead, now running in rivulets down his cheek, past his jaw, soaking into the collar of his faded field jacket. But it didn't stop there. As she yanked one arm higher, something snapped. Not bone, but cloth. The old combat fabric gave way under tension, and blood soaked through, darkening the shoulder seam, sliding down his back like ink dripping onto old parchment. Still, he made no sound, not a grunt, not a curse, nothing but breath and blood and silence. The boy with the phone was trembling now, but he didn't stop recording. This wasn't something you paused. This was history clawing through flesh to right itself. Lasker leaned in again, louder now, for the benefit of the hallway. Don't think just because you bled for this country, we owe you a stage to perform your trauma on. You think that jacket gives you a free pass? It gives you camouflage to hide behind while you manipulate sympathy. I know your kind. You play victim like it's a damn role. The words dripped venom, each syllable laced with contempt so pure it sparkled. But her mistake wasn't what she said. Her mistake was believing he'd stay quiet forever. Colton turned his head slightly, not enough to escape the hold, but enough to find the camera lens staring back at him, the unblinking eye of a world that had finally decided to watch. His gaze locked onto it, steady and calm with all the force of a tide that doesn't shout but drowns all the same. His voice was quiet, almost too quiet, but the microphone caught every syllable. "Make sure you get this," he said, each word chiseled from granite, slow and deliberate, as if carved from something sacred. "I'm not suing. I'm proving. No drama, no thunder. Just a statement sharper than any gavel, clearer than any verdict." Lasker froze for half a beat, caught not by guilt, but by something worse. Awareness. She knew. That phone, that line, the blood on the uniform, the hallway, the boy. It was all there, coalescing into a moment she couldn't erase, couldn't twist, couldn't overpower. But instead of backing off, she doubled down, pressing the cuff chain harder, whispering close to his ear, "No one's going to care. You think one clip changes anything? You're a has-been, in a ghost's uniform." But even as she said it, her voice cracked, not from fear, but from the tiny fracture of certainty beginning to crumble. Colton didn't reply. He didn't need to. He had already said everything necessary. His blood said the rest. When the hallway finally stirred, when murmurs filtered in from the courtroom, when other officers stepped out, when someone asked too quietly, "What's going on out here?" it was already too late. The damage was done. The performance Lasker accused him of had never happened. There was no theater, only truth, bleeding down a back that had once carried the weight of entire platoons. And now, once again, I carried something far heavier, the burden of proving a man's worth to a world that tried to erase it. The hallway still reeked of friction and fluorescent light, the air brittle with the aftermath of forced silence and leaking dignity. Blood lingered like punctuation on the shoulder of Colton's old uniform, soaking slowly into the threads as if history itself had decided to sign its name across his back. The cuffs clung to his wrists, too tight, too proud, but he stood steady, even pinned, even bruised. His breath was slow, his spine unbent. He was not a prisoner, he was a reminder. And as Lasker stood nearby, arms folded, sneers stitched across her lips like a scar that never learned how to heal, Colton moved. Not fast, not reckless. His left hand, still free, reached down into the inner pocket of his jacket. The movement was deliberate, unhurried, as though reaching for something sacred, not a weapon, not a threat, just something older. A small, battle-worn phone emerged, paint scratched off its edge, screen cracked at the corner. A veteran of another kind of war. He pressed the screen with his thumb, but the blood on his hand left a streak, a diagonal red smear over the glass, vibrant against digital blue. For a second, the phone didn't respond. Then, with one more touch, it lit up. He didn't scroll. He didn't search. He dialed a number etched in memory, not contacts. And then he lifted the phone to his ear, eyes fixed on nothing and everything all at once. He stood as a man who had been silenced too long, but never forgotten how to speak. "I need a trial back," he said quietly, almost conversationally, like he was ordering coffee. Honor fell down the stairs. "Someone's got to bring it back up." His voice didn't tremble. It resonated, low, certain, soft only in pitch, not in power. It didn't ask for help, it delivered notice. There was a pause, no more than a breath, and then a voice answered on the other end. Male, calm, steady, deep, not the kind of voice you raise yours against. "Brigadier General Knight, I'm listening." Time froze. The hallway, once alive with movement, locked into stunned paralysis. The student filming lowered his phone involuntarily. The security guard at the far end shifted like a shadow, learning it existed. A paralegal turned, lips parted, but no words. Even the damn air held its breath. Lasker stiffened. Something flickered across her face, disbelief battling recognition and losing. She stepped forward, narrowed her eyes, and scoffed, voice sharp as broken ice. "You expect me to believe that crap? You think saying some made-up title into a burner phone makes you somebody?" Colton didn't even look at her. He just tilted his head slightly, the way a hawk might glance toward the wind before taking flight. And then, slowly, he turned his head toward her. Not all the way. Just enough for her to see his mouth curve, not into a smirk, not into defiance, but into something colder, a smile without warmth, a smile forged in steel. "Not everyone calling the Pentagon needs to introduce themselves," he said. That was it. That was the strike. Not a punch, not a scream, just that line. Wrapped in calm, dipped in truth, aimed like a rifle through a pinhole. Lasker's mouth opened. A retort loaded and half-feared, but it died before it reached her teeth. The words collapsed under the weight of implication, the title, the tone, the unflinching way he held the phone like it wasn't power, but proof. Proof she had chained the wrong man in front of the wrong crowd at the wrong moment in history. The hallway hadn't changed, but the power had shifted, quietly, absolutely. Colton spoke again, this time to the phone, not to her. "Yes, sir. I'll wait." Then he lowered it, not ending the call, just letting it hang loosely in his hand, as if to say the next voice heard might not be his, but it would be loud enough to matter. Someone behind Lasker coughed. It wasn't nerves. It was tension cracking under pressure. The hallway now belonged to Colton, not because he'd taken it, because no one else had the authority to stand in it anymore. Lasker looked around and saw it, that invisible shift. That subtle collapse of whatever invisible empire she'd built for herself out of procedural muscle and institutional indifference. For the first time, her badge looked small. For the first time, her boots didn't echo. Colton's eyes drifted down to the floor, to the trail of his blood now drying in a crescent near the baseboard. He followed it with his gaze, not to wallow, but to remember. He always remembered. Not out of trauma, but because memory was his weapon. She had tried to erase his presence, mock his uniform, cage his silence. And yet, here he was, still standing, still bleeding, still in command. He turned slightly, adjusting his shoulders against the cold brick, then lifted the phone again and said only this: "Location confirmed, standing by." There was no need for announcements. No chest-beating declarations. That call, those few words, the way they landed like chess pieces placed instead of thrown, this wasn't theater. This was war in reverse. Not chaos, but discipline. Tactical, precise. Lasker, despite herself, took one step back. He didn't notice, or he did and chose not to care. For a man who had just been pinned, slammed, insulted, and bloodied, he looked alarmingly composed. It wasn't the calm of surrender. It was the calm of inevitability. The calm of someone who had been underestimated once too often by people who measured power in noise. And now, for the first time, noise wasn't enough. The silence that followed Colton's quiet statement clung to the walls like smoke after gunfire. Dense, suffocating, undeniable. He didn't lower the phone. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move a single muscle more than necessary. But somewhere on the other end of that call, Wheels had started turning, and here, where Lasker once stood so tall, something under her feet began to shift, subtle but irrevocable. Inside the courtroom, proceedings had resumed with forced formality. The judge cleared his throat, the clerk resumed typing, and witnesses shuffled in, unaware that outside a reckoning had already begun. Colton stood cuffed, blood drying on his jacket, looking more like a monument than a man. But monuments don't speak. And then the noise came, not from within, but from above. It started low, a tremble in the air, like thunder reconsidering its approach. Then it grew, rotors slicing the sky with military precision, the unmistakable snarl of a helicopter banking overhead. People inside the courthouse turned their heads, eyes drawn upward as glass trembled in the frames. The courtroom lights flickered once, just enough to jolt nerves. Judges paused mid-sentence. Even the stenographer looked up from her key. Outside, the sound thickened, layered now with the growl of engines. A convoy rolled down the street like thunder given wheels. Armored vehicles, not local, not police, coated in matte black and military codes, pulled up outside the courthouse, one after another, their arrival synchronized and silent but for the hum of power. No sirens, no lights, just presence. Then boots, the rhythm of trained men stepping in tandem. Black boots hitting concrete like hammers striking drums of war. The front doors swung open not with violence but with certainty. Military police in full uniform, bearing insignias too crisp and eyes too focused to be mistaken for local security, entered the hallway. They didn't yell, they didn't bark orders, they moved with the calm of wolves entering a familiar forest. Lasker's hand went instinctively to her hip, fingers brushing the grip of her sidearm before her brain even caught up. Reflex, not reason, but she barely touched it before a gloved hand closed over her wrist, tight, commanding, final. Another stepped in behind her, guiding her hand away from the holster, not with force, but with the type of authority that didn't allow for disagreement. Her eyes widened, a flicker of protest forming, but it never reached her lip, because now all eyes turned to the man in cuffs. Colton, unmoved, watched the soldiers approach. The leader stepped forward, saluted, not in ceremony, but in recognition. Then, without a word, he reached into his vest and produced a key. But Colton didn't wait. With slow precision, he reached up to the small compartment inside his collar and pulled a thin metallic pick. A flick, a click. The cuffs dropped to the floor like dead weight. He looked up and adjusted his collar, brushing dried blood from the edge. His hands, though bruised, moved with steady grace. He wasn't just removing restraints. He was resetting the terms of engagement. A reporter who had trailed the commotion from the courtroom raised her camera. She caught it all. The cuffs falling, the uniform straightening, the collar buttoned. 1 frame, 2 frames, 3. The hallway glowed briefly with the flash of recognition, not from her lens, but from the world beyond it. She had caught the moment history blinked. Colton turned slightly, looked at the soldiers, and nodded. Then, finally, his voice again. "Soldiers who've seen war don't carry keys," he said. "Not for themselves. They carry them to unlock whoever got it wrong." The line landed with seismic precision. Lasker stood frozen, her mouth as slightly open, jaw tight. Her hand was now useless at her side, no weapon, no command. She looked smaller now, not physically, but elementally, shrunk by presence, by shame, by the bitter sting of understanding she'd pulled a trigger that couldn't be undone. Around her, others didn't need to speak. They stepped aside. They cleared the way. They watched. Colton didn't look back at her. He didn't need to. She had become background, a symbol of what crumbles when power is mistaken for principle. Outside, the streets buzzed now, not with chaos, but with awakening. A crowd had formed, drawn by noise, by rumor, by that innate sense people have when something shifts beneath the surface. Phones were up, live streams rolling, comments flying. The footage of Colton unchaining himself under military escort had already started to spread, but it wasn't the vehicles or the uniforms that people reacted to. It was the posture, the calm, the unshakable gravity of a man standing exactly where he was supposed to stand, even if someone else tried to chain him elsewhere. Inside, the judge was no longer speaking. The gavel remained untouched. The system paused. Not in fear, in realization. 15 minutes. That's all it had taken. 15 minutes. From the moment Colton made the call to the moment steel dropped from his wrists. From the moment a nameplate hit the floor to the moment a nation's camera lens caught the rebuke mid-frame. Not a shot fired, not a door broken, just precision, just presence, just power in its purest, quietest form. Colton stood at the end of the hall, facing the corridor where it all began. The marble steps ahead of him still bore the faint smear of blood, a witness, a receipt. But now, instead of falling upon it, he walked past it, upright, unswayed. He exited not with ceremony, but with weight. Every step is a statement. Every breath is a reminder that justice isn't always served in courtrooms, but it is sometimes reclaimed there. And behind him, left standing in the silence she once commanded, was Lasker. Still, small, unarmed, in every sense of the word. She stood exactly where Colton had left her, surrounded by silence that screamed louder than sirens. The hallway was no longer a corridor of authority. It had become an execution ground, not of life but of illusions. And hers, Lasker's, were unraveling, one thread at a time. Her voice had dried in her throat, her rank, her gun, her badge, all weightless now in the shadow of a man she'd tried to humiliate, now walking free with the thunder of an entire institution behind him. The door to the main chamber groaned open again, not rushed, not loud, but slow, like a judge preparing to sentence with ritual. Colton returned. No military parade, no headlines in his footsteps, just him, upright, shoulders squared, the dried blood on his uniform now no longer a wound but a signature, and flanking him, only silence. Lasker turned. There was nowhere else to look. She was surrounded, but not by enemies. By consequence, the soldiers who had escorted Colton stood to the side now, not in a position to act, because they didn't need to. This part wasn't theirs. This belonged only to two people. The courtroom doors slammed shut again behind them. It echoed down the marble halls. It sounded like judgment. She barely had time to breathe before two officers stepped toward her, quicker than expected, with the clinical swiftness of those who don't ask permission, only execute orders. They moved as if the air had changed temperature, as if the world had shifted gravity. Her wrists were seized, not harshly, not cruelly, but with absolute control, and in the blink between disbelief and fury, she was twisted and driven down, face pressed against the stone floor of the courthouse, hands cuffed tightly behind her back. Her cheek slammed against the engraving etched across the center tile. One word, ancient and mocking now, justice. The letters were cold, sharp, carved so deep into the granite that the grit scraped her skin. Her nose bent sidewise. Her breath came in short, fast gulps. Her once polished uniform, crisp and tailored, now wrinkled and disheveled, folded against the same stone where she'd once watched Colton fall. Now she understood something ugly. There's a difference between kneeling and being put down. Colton approached, his pace even. Each footstep was a reminder. He didn't carry rage with him. He didn't speak until he stood directly above her, his shadow swallowing her form entirely. His eyes dropped to her, not with vengeance, but with precision, like a surgeon evaluating damage, like a general surveying the outcome of a necessary war. His voice came low, steady, neither angry nor triumphant. It rolled out like a verdict already written. "You threw honor to the ground," he said. "I'm only asking you to finish what you started. Kneel when you throw something away." She bucked against the cuffs, twisted, teeth clenched like cracked porcelain. Her face burned red, but not from exertion, from exposure, from the unbearable sensation of being seen exactly for what she was, without the armor of protocol, without the mask of command. "I don't even know who the hell you are," she hissed, her voice muffled by stone and humiliation, still clawing for dignity, even as it slipped through her clenched fists like sand. Colton leaned in just enough to let the next line fall directly into her ear. "You don't need to know," he said, slow, absolute. "You only need to remember you were wrong." It didn't roar. It didn't echo, but somehow it hit harder than any raised voice ever could, because it wasn't a lesson, it was a scar. Photographers had gathered now, word had leaked, and the rotors of justice didn't move quietly anymore. From the stairs outside to the cameras through the hallway glass, everyone saw it. Not the takedown, not the reversal. They saw what mattered, her, on the ground, face pressed into the words she once used like a weapon, and him, unmoved, unshaken, unafraid, speaking truth from a height she could never reach, not by rank, not by rhetoric. Her mouth opened again, desperate to claw back control. "You can't humiliate me like this." But the truth was, he hadn't. She had humiliated herself the moment she tried to crush a man's dignity under a boot. The only difference now was that the world was watching. Colton didn't respond. He didn't need to. He stepped back, nodded once toward the officers, and turned. The message was complete, not in volume, in posture, in the way silence followed him like respect. And her protests died behind him like static from a dying signal. The video would be everywhere in minutes, shared, clipped, looped, but it wasn't the footage that mattered. It was the still frame, that single image, her, cuffed, pressed into the word justice, and him walking away, head held level, spine straight, eyes forward. She had tried to make him kneel, and now she understood that power isn't in how loudly you shout someone down, it's whether they still stand when you're lying on the floor. He walked away from her with the ease of someone who had never needed revenge to prove victory. The woman on the ground, still cuffed, burning with humiliation, was no longer his concern. The hallway emptied behind him, but the image remained, a monument captured in real time, shared in angles, in clips, in frames that spread faster than fire. By the time Colton stepped outside the courthouse doors, the world had already begun to watch. It started with a single tweet, a photo of Lasker's face pressed into the granite, the word justice etched beneath her cheek like a cruel tattoo, and Colton mid-stride, unbent. Then came the caption, not from a politician or journalist, but from a college student who had seen the clip online and instinctively understood what was happening. The general stands. The hashtag detonated like a slow bomb. It wasn't screamed, it wasn't bought, it simply existed. Perfect, final, true. In less than an hour, it was trending on every platform, translated into multiple languages, woven into political debate, military blogs, and cultural headlines. But what made it unstoppable was what came next. Someone, anonymous, poetic, synced the video to the U.S. national anthem. No edits, no overproduction, just the footage. Colton walking away as the flag hung in the distance, Lasker still on the ground, his boots scuffing against the seal of the court. And then, during the crescendo of the music, his quote appeared in white font over black. "When I stand up, it's not to attack, it's to see who still dares to sit." The internet froze, then exploded. Talk shows ran segments on it within hours. Think pieces flooded op-ed columns. Congressional aides cited the moment during closed-door sessions about law enforcement oversight, but Colton wasn't listening. He wasn't watching the wave. He had never surfed moments. He had always built them. Reporters descended like crows to a landmark, microphones outstretched, ready for headlines, hungry for sound bites. They camped outside the building. They followed leads. They requested statements. But Colton said nothing. Not on camera, not online, not on record. His silence became the story. That same night, while the world debated meaning, politics, and legacy, a fax rolled through at 3 major newsrooms. The header read only his name, Colton M.M. There was no logo, no agency, just that and a sentence typed cleanly in all caps centered on the page. No further comment. You saw enough. The silence was louder than applause. Some found the restraint maddening. Others found it divine. The idea that a man could endure humiliation, violence, and public injustice, then rise, respond, and retreat with nothing but a posture and a single fax was unthinkable in the age of noise, and yet that was what made it work. He didn't sell the story. He didn't narrate his redemption. He let the facts breathe, let the image stand unshaken by explanation. What happened needed no embellishment. The truth was already clean. Meanwhile, old footage began to resurface, photos from wars past, grainy video from forgotten ceremonies, images of Colton, younger, in uniform, standing next to presidents, commanders, and fallen brothers. Each new piece of evidence stacked on the mountain of credibility like bricks laid to honor something bigger than him, something he embodied without demanding it be named. Military forums lit up with veterans confirming his rank, his record, and his past. But Colton didn't validate a single claim, not once. He never stood behind a podium. He never raised his voice to correct the record. Because that wasn't the point. He wasn't reclaiming a name. He was restoring a standard. And while others fought to define the moment with headlines, he let the moment define itself, not through interviews, but through resonance. People stood in front of courthouses nationwide in silence. Some played the anthem. Some simply stood. They didn't chant. They didn't shout. They just stood. Because when a man like Colton stands, it permits others to do the same. Lasker was suspended pending investigation, but even that felt like a footnote now. Her name appeared on legal filings and disciplinary records, but it no longer carried weight. She was no longer the center of the story. She was the caution in its margins. Colton, meanwhile, vanished from the public eye. He didn't disappear, he withdrew. He returned to his life with the quiet consistency of someone who had never done it for the camera. No press, no memoir, just a fact. A nation sat in that silence and, for the first time in a long time, understood its meaning. The silence Colton left behind didn't fade. It metastasized, moved through corridors, up staircases, through chambers and offices where power used to rest unquestioned, and the courtroom, once the nucleus of control, now pulsed with discomfort. The image of Lasker kneeling on the seal of justice didn't vanish with the news cycle. It lingered, metastasizing into pressure, into inquiry, into a demand no longer whispering. It was knocking. So the court responded, not out of moral awakening, but because the silence had grown louder than their authority. The federal judiciary, stiff-backed and slow-moving, convened a special session, a closed-door emergency hearing announced in neutral tones, as if history could still be negotiated. The subject was clinical, an internal inquiry into the arrest of Marcus Elijah Colton, retired military officer. But the air, thick with consequence, told the real story. Judges arrived one by one, robes dragging behind them like capes that had forgotten how to fly. Federal attorneys filed in with folders too thin to be reassuring. The press, though barred from the room, lined the steps outside like modern-day jurors armed with live streams and long memories. They didn't need access. They had evidence. Inside, the chamber's overhead lights hummed with discomfort. A screen flickered to life, neutral, administrative, before playing the video. Not the famous one. Not Colton walking away. This one was older, dustier. A file never meant to be found again. The footage showed a different hallway, a different day, but the same officer. Lasker, younger, leaner, still bitter, shoving a handcuffed black teenager into a wall. Face first, hard. No provocation, no resistance. The boy bled. She laughed. The case had gone to court. It had been sealed. She had walked free, praised internally for discipline under pressure. The file was buried, with a verdict coated in bureaucratic ice. Incident closed, no action recommended. Now it played again, in silence, in full. No one spoke, because to speak would mean admitting they had all seen it the first time and done nothing. Across from the screen sat the current Chief Justice, a man whose name had been printed beneath decisions with real consequences for real people. He watched the video with a frozen expression, not surprise, not shock, but the deep, burning awareness of what it meant to have missed something you were supposed to see, or worse, ignored it. When the screen went black, no discussion followed. No need. The evidence was never the problem. The evidence had always existed. The issue was choice. And then Quietly, methodically, the Chief Justice reached to his desk and removed the brass badge affixed to its edge. He didn't say a word. He didn't issue a statement. He just lifted the symbol of his role, held it in both hands like a weight he had carried too long, and laid it down on the desk. It clicked against the wood, sharp and small, but louder than any gavel. Outside, the news broke like thunder on marble. The public didn't cheer, they didn't rage, they simply watched, because by now the tone had shifted. This wasn't a spectacle, it was a reckoning. Colton wasn't there. Of course, he wasn't. He didn't attend tribunals that came too late. He didn't clap for delayed justice dressed as reform. But he did send something, an envelope, hand-delivered by courier, signed with only his initials. Inside was a single medal, a military commendation, old but pristine, with his name engraved cleanly on the back. Alongside it, a note typed on letterhead with military precision. "Justice is too scared to speak. I have no use for its praise. Return to sender." No speech, no glare, just the gesture. And that gesture echoed deeper than any ruling, because it didn't just question the institution, it dismissed it, with finality, with grace. And the system, once so deaf to please, heard it. In break rooms across the judiciary, young clerks whispered his name now with a different kind of reverence. Judges revisited rulings they thought were buried. Internal memos shifted in tone. Panels were convened to evaluate conduct histories. But Colton never once commented. He never demanded heads. He never named names. Because this was never about revenge. It was about what happens when silence finally decides to speak. And now, it wasn't him doing the talking. It was the court, echoing the weight of his walk, the tone of his facts, the steel in his silence. One by one, they were forced to step out of the shadows he'd walked through and stand in the light he left behind. The court had been forced to speak, but Colton did not. He watched from afar as officials scrambled to adjust their tone, as institutions whispered apologies in the form of resignations and policy memos, as names once protected by silence were finally printed beside words like disciplinary and investigation. But he didn't answer their invitations. He didn't draft statements. And when Congress extended its formal request for him to testify, to stand beneath the dome and let his voice be folded into the record, he declined without a footnote. As for Colton, the real testimony was not meant for marble halls and polished microphones. It was meant for quieter places, places where sacrifice wasn't spotlighted. It was buried. The sun had barely risen when he arrived at Arlington. There was no ceremony, no escort, just Colton, alone in that uniform, no longer battered but worn like memory, walking through rows of stones that didn't rise to meet him. He moved slowly, not because of age, but because reverence has its rhythm. His boots crunched softly across frost-hardened grass, past sections marked only by numbers and silence. In one hand he held a simple notebook. The cover was scratched leather, the kind you don't throw away, the kind that outlasts trends and decades. In the other he carried a pen and tucked into his waistband an old combat knife, its handle darkened by time, its blade dulled but not broken. He found his place near the rear edge of the cemetery, where the trees no longer stood as decoration but as witnesses. Here, in the section with the fewest flowers, the most unspoken names, he sat. He did not kneel. He sat with his back straight against the trunk of a dying oak, and he opened the notebook. One by one he began to write. Not eulogies, not biographies, names, just names. Soldiers who had served beside him. Names lost to error. Names are buried under clerical decisions and politics. Men who never received commendations because they died before someone could sign the paper. Men who were erased because they were inconvenient. Brown names. Black names. Names that didn't fit the ribbon color of the year. Each name he wrote came with a moment of breath. He paused after every stroke, as if saying it aloud without saying anything at all. The wind moved through the branches like a choir with no words. The sun warmed the tips of the marble stones just enough to cast faint shadows behind them, like they too refused to lie flat. And when he ran out of ink, he didn't stop. He reached for the knife, not with ceremony, not with rage. He held it like a sculptor, like a priest. He approached one of the stones. Its surface was smooth, unmarked except for a numeric code where a name should have been, and slowly, carefully, he carved just a single line near the base. No one dies if their name still stands. The blade didn't cut deep. It didn't need to. The stone didn't cry out, but the silence that followed felt heavier. When he finished, he stepped back, sheathed the knife, and returned to the notebook. He didn't look around. He didn't check if anyone had seen him. He didn't perform, but someone had. A man approached from between the rows. Civilian jacket, hands in his pockets, a slow walk like someone unsure if they should intrude. He didn't speak. He simply stopped a few paces away, eyes falling on the name being written. Recognition flickered, but still no words. Colton didn't look up. He didn't need to. After a moment, the man straightened his spine and gave a crisp, silent salute. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't filmed. It wasn't meant for anyone but Colton. Colton nodded once, small, respectful, and the man lowered his hand, then simply stood. No questions, no selfies, no declarations, just silence shared. And in that silence, something vast took form. Not grief, not rage. Something slower, older. Something that had no anthem but still commanded allegiance. The kind of respect that doesn't require explanation. When the man eventually walked away, Colton remained seated. He wrote a few more names. Then he closed the notebook, stood, and placed it gently on one of the unmarked stones. Not to leave behind, but to entrust. He walked out the same way he came, quiet, alone, straight-backed, and the cemetery unchanged. Somehow felt fuller, because sometimes the loudest sound in a country obsessed with noise is a man writing down names no one else remembered to say. The silence that Colton left at the cemetery didn't stay buried. It traveled, unseen, like a current beneath marble floors and polished offices, slipping through the cracks of city halls and behind doors where power had gotten too comfortable. In the days that followed, a strange tension hummed through the air. Not quite fear, not quite guilt, but the trembling that comes when you realize something you ignored is coming back with a name. And then it arrived. On a Tuesday morning, in the inboxes of every major news outlet, editorial board, and veteran affairs desk across the country. The sender, anonymous. The contents, a single letter, scanned, typed, and unsigned, but surgical. It wasn't a rant, it was a kill shot. The document laid bare a truth that many had suspected, but none had dared confirm. The mayor, William Harland, 3-term incumbent, decorated with just enough philanthropy to keep reporters at bay, had years earlier issued a direct order to dismiss multiple complaints from military veterans against local law enforcement. Among those complaints was one with a familiar name, Lasker. The file revealed that the incident involving Colton wasn't the first. It wasn't even the worst. Internal memos, buried reports, and redacted witness statements showed a disturbing pattern, each pointing back to the same decision-maker. The mayor had chosen silence over scrutiny, protection over principle, and it wasn't just negligence. It was contempt. The final paragraph of the leak quoted a voice recording from a closed-door meeting, time-stamped and verified. When asked about one of the complaints, specifically the one Colton had submitted years ago, long before his name became untouchable, Mayor Harlan's voice responded coldly, without hesitation. "He's just some crazy old black vet. Let him rot." It took 20 minutes for the quote to hit the news cycle. It took 6 more for the public to erupt. Cable news spun into crisis mode. Online platforms lit up like an electric grid surging under too much weight. Editorials screamed betrayal. And the veterans, the real ones, the ones whose names don't trend, answered not with noise, but with unity. 34 retired service members signed a letter to Congress calling for the immediate resignation and impeachment of Mayor Harland. The list wasn't alphabetical. It was ranked by service. At the top was a name the country hadn't seen in decades. Colonel Reuben Vance, Silver Star recipient, long presumed retired from all public life. Second on the list was a name known only to some, Jorge Mendez, who had once dragged Colton's bleeding body across a minefield in Kandahar and hadn't spoken to a reporter since. None of them gave interviews, but someone else did something louder. A small envelope arrived on Capitol Hill. No return address, no seal, just a note, handwritten in neat, steady penmanship, with one item inside, a military insignia snapped in half, jagged edges left raw. The note read only, "Broken ranks begin with broken oaths. Let the record reflect. MMLC." That was all. No cameras, no press release. But Congress read it, and when the envelope was passed from aide to senator to advisor, it burned. Not because it threatened, but because it didn't have to. Harlan tried to respond, of course. He held a press conference, blinking under lights. His voice lacquered with the usual layers of denial and deflection. He said he didn't recall the quote. He said the audio was doctored. He said he respected the military. But even as the words left his mouth, they felt like ash. Behind him, the crowd didn't move. They didn't boo. They didn't shout. They just stood. Dozens of veterans, lined shoulder to shoulder, wearing old jackets, holding folded flags, saying nothing. Their silence cut deeper than any question. Harlan's approval rating collapsed overnight. Petitions surged. Protests followed, but not loud ones. They were filled with people just standing in front of the city hall, courthouses, veteran memorials, holding signs that didn't ask for change. They expected it, and in the background, Colton remained absent, not because he wasn't watching, because he didn't need to be present to lead. The system had finally been forced to reckon not with protest, but with proof. And the people who had built thrones on the backs of the forgotten were now watching those thrones splinter. Because sometimes a man doesn't need to knock a king down. He just needs to remind the kingdom who paid for the crown. The mayor had fallen. His name, once wrapped in ceremony and self-congratulation, now hung limp in headlines no longer asking questions, but writing conclusions. But even as the machinery of political consequence churned forward, petitions, resignations, committee reviews, Colton remained distant. He hadn't spoken since the last stone was carved. He hadn't written. He hadn't shown his face on screen. That silence was not avoidance, it was discipline. It was a choice. He had already said what needed saying, not in words, in what he did, in what he refused to do. And yet, there came a moment that felt different, not because it was louder, because it was quieter, a private invitation, extended not from Capitol Hill or a major broadcast network, but from a small regional military committee responsible for maintaining a modest monument tucked in the foothills outside a forgotten county line. No cameras, no audience, no agenda, just a small group of veterans gathering for the annual remembrance of names that most of the country had never heard. Most years, the ceremony went unnoticed, a routine honoring the invisible. But this year, a name was added to the program, not to be read, to be present. Colton arrived alone. No escort, no formal dress limo, no entourage. He wore his dress uniform, unadorned except for what couldn't be removed. His bearing, when he stepped onto the field surrounding the monument, the earth seemed to hold him differently. The trees didn't sway. The ground didn't speak, but everything around him settled. It didn't feel like a homecoming. It felt like gravity had returned to its rightful axis. He approached the stone not as a guest, but as if answering a long-delved roll call. The monument was simple, a sculpture of soldiers in motion, frozen mid-advance, boots caught between ground and memory, rifles slung but unused, posture straight, not out of pride, but out of resolve. Around them were etched names. No ranks, no titles, just names. It was never about who had command. It was about who had kept walking. Colton stopped 3 paces from the edge. He didn't move closer. He didn't need proximity to feel weight. A veteran stepped forward from the small semicircle of attendees. His voice cracked, not from age, but from reverence. "General Colton, the floor is yours." Colton didn't nod. He didn't offer thanks. He stepped forward slowly and placed both hands behind his back. His chin was high, but not elevated. His eyes weren't on the audience. They were on the statue. His voice, when it came, was not booming. It was clear, intentional, like the click of a safety coming off. "People ask what it means to stand," he began, his words not hurried, not languid, just true, as if it's something you do to make a point, as if standing were a gesture. He paused, not for effect, but because the truth didn't need decoration. Standing isn't about being tall or being right. It's about being accountable, about being the one who doesn't move when the world does. No one shifted. No one blinked. "Honor," he continued, "is not in a badge or a flag or a speech. It's in the moment you get knocked down and choose not to rise for yourself, but for the man who can't." There was no wind. The sky didn't interrupt. Even the insects seemed to stop short. He turned his head slightly, just enough to see the edge of the crowd. "I didn't stand because they cuffed me. I didn't speak because they hit me. I didn't answer because they mocked me. I stood because someone had to. Not louder, just longer." His hand slid into the inner breast of his jacket, drawing out a folded piece of paper. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. Everyone there already understood what names it held. "When they asked me to speak, I said nothing, because silence was louder than the questions. But today," he turned toward the stone, "I'll speak. Not for justice, not for apology, but to return the meaning to something they've made a prop." He took a breath, then finished. "To stand is not to resist. It is to remember, to make visible the ones they buried in bureaucracy and forgot in peace." He stepped back, not ceremonially, just enough to let the words settle. The crowd didn't move, not because they were frozen, but because movement would have broken something sacred. Colton's words hadn't roused applause. They had rooted silence, and that was what made them holy. No speechwriter could have penned what he said, because it wasn't a speech. It was memory made audible. It was oath without uniform, command without volume. He folded the paper slowly, tucking it back inside his jacket as though sealing a chapter not meant to be repeated. And then, in one measured motion, he descended the 3 steps from the platform and stood at the foot of the statue. Not beside it, not above it, but level. His hand brushed the edge of the base. The stone was cold, its surface worn by years of rain and indifference. It had survived because no one bothered to move it. That in itself was a metaphor. From within the lining of his coat, Colton produced a small metal chisel. Its handle was dull, its edges smoothed by age and use. It had been in his family since before the war, carried not for defense but remembrance. He ran a thumb along its length. Then he knelt. But it wasn't a submission. It wasn't a concession. It was respect, measured, earned, and unspoken. He pressed the chisel to the base of the statue, where there was space between the names and the dirt. The first tap was soft, the second firm, and then slowly, deliberately, he began to carve. He didn't rush. He didn't look around. His body hunched with precision, not weakness. Each motion chipped away at stone like memory cutting through silence. 1 letter, 2, then a word. It wasn't a signature. It was a statement. He stood for the fallen. No more, no less. Not his full name. Not a title. Just the truth, etched beneath the truth of others. When he finished, he didn't rise right away. He set the chisel down carefully beside the words and stayed crouched, one hand pressed against the stone, as if steadying it or himself. Then, in a motion so smooth it felt rehearsed, he pushed up from the ground and stood once more. His knees did not creak. His back did not bend. He rose like a man who had never been on his knees in the first place. The others watched in stillness. A woman near the rear clutched her coat tighter, as if holding on to something invisible. A man standing beside her removed his cap, not to wipe sweat, but in acknowledgement. No one moved forward. No one tried to approach. They understood the ceremony was over, not by schedule, but by tone. Nothing more needed to be said, and nothing more would be. Colton turned toward them, not to deliver closing remarks, but to offer a single, brief nod. His eyes passed over the group, not scanning, not searching, but seeing, as if marking them down, as if adding their presence to the names in his pocket. He stepped away from the statue and began to walk toward the edge of the clearing. His pace was measured, his gait even. There was no weight behind him, only space, the kind of space that follows only after something true has been spoken. And then, from the crowd, a voice rose, not to interrupt, but to offer. "Sir," someone said quietly, "do you want us to archive what you wrote?" Colton didn't turn. His reply floated back, light but final. "No need to save it." A pause. "Stone doesn't forget." The words had been carved. The silence had been heard. And now, as Colton disappeared beyond the edge of the field, the absence he left behind said more than presence ever could. The ceremony had not ended. It had transformed, because what had happened there was not a tribute, it was a transmission. In the days that followed, the story spread, not through official channels, not through viral clips, but by word of mouth, one witness at a time. A grainy photo taken by a retired medic captured Colton mid-carve, chiseled to stone, back turned, the curve of his shoulder echoing the arc of the etched words. The photo wasn't filtered and wasn't captioned. It didn't need a caption. It simply circulated, quietly, like the gospel passed from hand to hand. And then, without prompting, the message appeared beneath it, spray-painted on a wall near an abandoned recruiting office, handwritten in chalk on a high school campus, scribbled in the corner of a folded newspaper. "He stood for the fallen." It wasn't a slogan, it wasn't a movement, it was a compass point. The message made its way into speeches, deliberate or not. A city mayor quoted it during a veterans funding hearing. A high school principal repeated it in a morning announcement. A preacher stitched it into a Sunday sermon without explaining where it came from. No one claimed authorship. No one needed to. It belonged to whoever understood what it meant. Back at the site of the monument, people began arriving, not in tour buses, not with guided maps. They came alone, in pairs, in silence. Some to see the inscription, some leave something behind. Coins, patches, notes. One woman left her wedding band beneath the words, folded inside a wrinkled service letter addressed to her husband, who never returned. Another placed a photograph of her father dated 3 days before the Tet Offensive with the words, "We remember because someone remembered first." There were no press releases, no coverage, but eventually someone from the local Parks Department called the Department of Defense. "There's a name scratched into the monument," the official reported. "We're aware," came the response. "Should we remove it?" "No," said the voice on the other end. "It stays." The words were never officially added to the National Registry, but unofficially they became canon. They were spoken at the academy graduations, whispered during flag-folding ceremonies, printed inside pocket Bibles are sent overseas with recruits, not by order, by memory. And while others spoke of it, the man who carved them remained silent. Colton did not appear at any of the commemorations. He didn't record a message. When reached for comment, he faxed a single page back to the requesting institution, typed, all caps, no signature. "You need me to say it again. You didn't hear it the first time." That was the final word. But for those who were there, who heard it the first time, it was enough to last, because meaning doesn't always ask for attention. Sometimes it just waits to be understood. Seasons passed, but the words remained. Wind polished the edges of the carving, rain deepened the grooves, but none of it wore it away. The more time he tried to erase it, the more it seemed the stone pushed back. The inscription, "He stood for the fallen," refused to be softened. It had outlived the news cycles, outlasted the outrage, and in that refusal, it gained meaning, not because it was etched by a man who had become a symbol, but it reminded the country what symbols were supposed to mean. The Department of Veterans Affairs sent a quiet team to the site, not for removal, for recognition. They took photographs, measured dimensions, spoke to witnesses in plain clothes. No podium, no flag raising, Just documentation sealed not by ceremony but by quiet intent. A file was opened, coded by initials, not headlines. MMC. No more explanation needed. Then came the vote. A state congressional committee met in private to review a single proposal. Simple on paper, seismic in implication. A resolution to amend the monument's registry and formalize the addition of one line. Not to the top, not even among the names, but at the base, beneath it all. The debate didn't last long. It passed unanimously. The next week, workers arrived at dawn, not to replace, but to preserve. They reinforced the stone, cleaned its perimeter, installed a permanent brass plate directly beneath Colton's hand-carved line. The font was simple. Military. Nothing ornamental, just a confirmation of what already existed. General Marcus Elea Colton, he stood for the fallen. That same day, without announcement, a small group gathered at the site. No program, no press, just veterans, locals. And at the edge of the group, unnoticed at first, stood a man in plain uniform. No rank displayed, no medals, just the stance. That unmistakable spine, straight as ever. Colton didn't approach the statue. He didn't need to. He stood a few paces back, arms behind his back, chin level. One of the veterans noticed, then another. Slowly they turned, and then, silently, one by one, they began to stand like him. No orders given, no names were called, just a posture shared, a chain reaction of reverence. A young boy, no older than 10, clutched his father's hand, whispered, "Is that the general?" The father didn't answer. He didn't need to, because in that moment, no one was asking who Colton was. They were remembering what it meant to stand. He nodded once to the crowd, not as farewell, but as an affirmation. And then, for the final time that day, he turned, walking back down the path without a sound, leaving behind no words, just the truth. Because men like him don't raise statues, they raise standards, and long after they're gone, the silence where they once stood still speaks. The silence that followed Colton's final act at the monument didn't fade, it evolved, it grew roots. It became something else entirely, a summons, not a loud one, not a scream, but a pull, unmistakable to those who had waited too long to be remembered. And for many, it led back to one name that had been left behind on purpose: Lamont Rhodes. No medals, no photo ops, just a file buried under other files, a case mislabeled, and a spine that had been shattered by a baton in a hallway too dim for justice to walk through. The story had surfaced once, years ago, before the world was ready to care. Back then, the footage was deemed inconclusive. The statement said Lamont had resisted, that his injury was accidental, no charges were filed, no apologies offered, and slowly he disappeared, until now. Now, because Colton had stood for the fallen, people were asking about the ones who had been pushed first. Under pressure from veterans organizations and a storm of editorial letters flooding state offices, the Justice Oversight Committee announced an emergency review of historical misconduct cases involving active duty veterans. Number 1 on the list: Rhodes, Lamont A., 1st Battalion Bravo Company. Discharged, disabled, forgotten. The video, once lost, was recovered from a corrupted archive server. A junior analyst, herself a child of veterans, traced the metadata and forced the frame back into clarity. It played in silence. Black and white grain, timestamp flickering in the corner. Lamont, in full uniform, stood at a reception counter in a precinct office. He wasn't shouting, he wasn't gesturing, just holding a piece of paper out to an officer half his size. You could see it. The subpoena in his hand. He was complying. Calm. And then it happened. From behind the desk, the officer stood, shouted something inaudible, and shoved Lamont. He stumbled, caught himself, and raised his hands, palms up. That's when the second officer charged in from the hallway. No warning, no hesitation. The baton came down right into his back. Once, twice, a third strike, just as Lamont collapsed sideways, head hitting the tile, and then he didn't move. The final frame showed Lamont's hand twitching against the edge of the paper, still holding the subpoena. They played the footage at the hearing. No overdub, no commentary, just the hum of a courtroom. where everyone suddenly remembered how loud silence could be. Colton was there, back row, dressed in black, head unbowed, shoulders carved from stone. He hadn't come to testify, he came to witness. The presiding judge leaned forward after the video finished. She scanned the room, her gaze heavy. This footage was not admitted during the original hearing, nor were statements from medical professionals, the VA, or the victim's commanding officer. Today, we open the floor. A moment passed. No one stood. Then a young man, barely 30, stepped forward, Lamont's nephew. He wore no uniform, just a pin on his lapel, the insignia of Bravo Company. "My uncle didn't just lose his spine in that hallway," he said. "He lost his voice. And now you finally hear it. Every crack in that tile, every frame of that tape, that's his voice screaming for justice you denied him." The room trembled, not from noise, but from held breath. Then, unexpectedly, the judge turned to the back. "General Colton," she said, tone level, "do you wish to speak?" All eyes turned. Colton rose, not dramatically, just enough. He walked forward with deliberate steps, each footfall echoing in the chamber like an old drumbeat. When he reached the stand, he didn't look at the judge, he didn't look at the press, he looked at the screen, still frozen behind him, Lamont's hand locked in digital twitch. "I was there the day Lamont saved my life," he began. "We were pinned, outnumbered, and I had already stopped believing I'd make it back." He didn't flinch. He didn't pause. "He pulled me out while the sky burned behind us." Colton turned now, locking eyes with the panel. Years later, he stood again, in this city, with paper in hand trying to prove the system still worked, and your answer to that was to break his back. A low murmur rippled through the gallery. The judge said nothing. She didn't have to. Colton's tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You ask if I have something to say to the man who did it," he continued, eyes narrowing as he turned toward the defendant's table. "I don't." He gestured to the screen. "I'll let him talk to the back." He broke. Gasps. No one moved. The defendant, now a graying former officer in a dated suit, shifted in his seat, lips parted but silent. Colton stepped down. No bow, no flourish. Just walked back to his seat, spine straight, dignity untouched. When the court recessed, the news exploded, not just because of what was said, but because of what was no longer able to be denied. Colton hadn't come to fight. He had come to illuminate, and the nation, this time, had no shadow big enough to hide in. The courtroom air was no longer silent. It was heavy. It carried the weight of weeks of headlines, of public pressure boiling through every hallway and camera feed. No one spoke louder than the truth that had resurfaced after years buried under bureaucratic cowardice and political silence. Now, it stood poised to crack the marble walls of institutional denial. Colton arrived early and sat in the rear of the gallery, still, deliberate, unreadable. He didn't wear medals. He didn't bring an escort. He brought presence. Enough of it that the guards at the door had stiffened when he passed, as if an unspoken command had marched in. Lamont's hearing wasn't about closure. It was about honor. A broken spine couldn't speak for itself, but a man who had walked through war and loss and fire could speak for what remained. The hush that fell as Lamont entered was not one of sympathy. It was reverence. His chair moved with a rhythm that belonged to no one else. He pushed himself forward in that old wheelchair with practiced ease, his hands calloused, his fingers careful. The chair's left wheel creaked every 2 seconds, the sound becoming a metronome of defiance. The fabric of his uniform, worn at the seams but starched, brushed lightly against the metal armrests, and on his chest his name tag, L. Rhodes. No theatrics, no dramatics. Just reality, forged in pain and dignity. The officer who had crippled him sat less than 15 feet away. He looked older now, smaller somehow, not because time had ravaged him, but because truth had stripped him. His suit didn't fit. His apology didn't either. He squirmed in his chair like every second scorched his skin, eyes darting from Lamont to the bench, unable to meet the weight of what he'd done. Cowardice isn't always loud. Sometimes it whimpers in the third row, under fluorescent lights, surrounded by strangers who already know the ending. The judge, a woman with eyes like frost and lips drawn taut with discipline, called the room to order. Proceedings began. The prosecution didn't need much. They had the footage. They had the reports. They had the original complaint that had been filed and conveniently misplaced, and they had the man sitting in front of them whose vertebrae had been snapped by fear, dressed in authority. When the defense asked for leniency, citing the officer's years of service, his mental health struggles, his misinterpretation of Lamont's approach that day, a sound escaped from the back, dry, bitter, sharp. It was a single laugh. It came from a reporter who had been present when Colton first appeared in court weeks ago. She quickly silenced herself, but the echo lingered like a truth that refused to sit down. Then the officer asked to speak. The court hesitated. Lamont gave a slight nod. Permission granted. The man stood, pale, voice wobbling like a man already halfway to collapse. "I was scared," he began. "I thought he was reaching for something. He couldn't finish." Lamont stared at him. He didn't blink. He didn't flinch. Then he rolled forward a few feet and spoke, and every ear in the room strained not to miss a single syllable. "You hit me before I could stand," Lamont said, voice level as steel. "So today I sit to make sure you remember what standing means." The judge remained still for a long moment, her gavel untouched, her expression unreadable. The courtroom waited, breath suspended, like the next word might change more than just the fate of one man. It might rewrite a part of the system itself. Lamont did not say more. He didn't need to. The weight of his silence filled the space louder than any testimony could have. And across from him, the man who had stolen his mobility now looked as if the air around him had turned to stone. He hadn't expected those words. Not phrased that way, not with that calm. When the judge finally spoke, her voice came low but iron-bound. "Let the record reflect that the statement was received and entered as part of victim impact testimony." She turned to the officer. "Mr. Keating, do you have anything further?" he stammered. I never meant to hurt anyone." His voice broke mid-sentence. "I thought he was someone else. I thought—" Lamont's gaze didn't budge. The courtroom had heard enough. Keating's excuses fell flat, like rain against concrete. They landed, but changed nothing. The judge adjusted her glasses. "This court recognizes the defendant's service, but it also recognizes his actions, the consequences of which are irreversible. The footage from the incident, the suppressed complaint, and the verified identity of the victim present a clear pattern of negligence, bias, and unprovoked violence." Her voice sharpened. "Justice delayed does not mean justice denied. It only means we were late." She picked up the gavel. "For assault with grievous bodily harm, obstruction of justice, and violation of civil rights, the sentence is 20 years in federal prison. No parole, no appeal." The sound of the gavel was not a strike. It was a detonation. Final, echoing, unmistakable. And then something unexpected happened. Colton stood. He did not raise his hand. He did not speak. He simply rose from his seat with the kind of controlled energy that needed no introduction, no context. The room turned slowly toward him. One by one, like dominoes of conscience, people followed. First, a young Marine with 2 crutches. Then an older woman in a faded navy sweater. Then a pair of men in Air Force jackets. Soon the gallery stood silent, aligned, unblinking. Lamont remained seated, of course, but the way his head lifted, the angle of his jaw, the stillness of his breath, he was no less standing than anyone else in that room. No applause, no chants, no slogans. Just a room full of Americans remembering what respect looked like when it wasn't forced, when it rose from truth instead of fear. Reporters later asked why they stood. One woman said, "Because he stood for us." Another whispered, "Because we forgot how." Outside the courthouse, the air was thicker than heat, not from temperature, but tension, an invisible residue of what had just transpired. The reporters tried to shove microphones into mouths, but few spoke. Those who had stood inside walked out with their silence intact, not as a lack of words, but as an act of preservation. No one wanted to dilute what had just occurred. Colton exited last. He didn't walk through the main doors. He chose the side exit, the one less photographed. less chaotic. As he stepped onto the concrete landing, a young journalist with too much courage and too little experience approached him, recorder in hand, voice eager. "General Colton, would you say this is justice?" He paused. That pause alone made the camera crew reset their focus. Colton turned only slightly. "This is a correction," he said. Justice would have kept him walking, and with that he kept walking. By that evening, the footage had already been dissected across 1,000 feeds. The moment Lamont spoke, the look on Keating's face, the silence when Colton rose, the single phrase, "I sit so you won't confuse me again." It lit fire across forums, think pieces, and academic roundtables. But it didn't stop there. At a local high school, a teacher played the court segment during a civics lesson. No one checked their phones during that period. At a nursing home for veterans, the residents requested the clip on repeat in their common room. And in a small church in Georgia, a pastor who had never met Lamont nor Colton opened his sermon with just 5 words, "Let's talk about standing seated." But the real fire came from those who had kept quiet for far too long. An anonymous group of disabled veterans released a letter. It wasn't long, just a single page. It read, "We may not stand tall anymore, but thanks to Lamont, we all remember how." It was signed only with military IDs. The list went on for 2 pages, and then came the photo. It wasn't staged. It wasn't planned. It was snapped by a bystander and uploaded without a filter. The image showed Lamont, still in uniform, sitting in his wheelchair outside the courthouse alone, his hands resting on his lap, his posture upright, and the late afternoon sun hitting the silver braid on his shoulder. There was no flag behind him, no podium in sight, just one man, sitting like he was born to lead a revolution, with nothing but restraint. By the next morning, it had been retweeted over 4 million times. One caption rose above the rest, "Still standing, even when seated." Later that night, as the world spun beneath 1,000 blinking news tickers and endless panel debates, Lamont sat alone in the dim corner of a quiet motel room, one of those roadside places where the air conditioner hums louder than the silence it's trying to fill. His uniform was folded neatly on the nightstand, the creases still sharp, the fabric still smelling faintly of sunlight and ceremony. He stared at his own hands for a while. They trembled slightly, not from fear, not from pain, but from the magnitude of what he had carried that day. There was no celebration, no champagne, no crowd banging on his door to shake his hand. He hadn't stood, but he had lifted something larger than a flag, heavier than any burden his spine could ever support again. He had lifted a mirror to a nation and dared it to look. His phone buzzed once, a message. Unknown number. It read, "You didn't flinch. They'll remember that longer than any verdict." No name attached, but he didn't need one. He replied with 3 words, "We're not done." Meanwhile, somewhere across the state, Colton stood in a parking lot alone beneath a dying street lamp. He was looking at the courthouse dome in the distance. It shimmered faintly in the darkness like a coin half buried in ash. He didn't walk closer. He didn't speak. But in his hand he held something, the service ribbon from his chest, now frayed at the edges. Without ceremony, he placed it at the foot of a bronze statue near the steps, a statue of justice, blindfolded, sword drawn, scale steady. He didn't linger. By morning, someone had found it. They posted the image online, just the ribbon resting there with a note tucked under it, written in block letters, "Let the blindfold come off when truth no longer hides." That note became a headline. Later that week, someone carved Lamont's words onto a park bench just outside the courtroom. "I sit so you won't confuse me again." The city tried to remove it. The public pushed back. The bench stayed. Then other benches across the country began to carry the same carving, etched not by officials but by hands unknown, quiet tributes scattered like seed. Nothing about that day was traditional justice. There were no fireworks, no victory parades. But in diners, schools, police departments, and veterans' halls, the silence left behind spoke of something more lasting, a kind of reckoning you don't celebrate, but carry, quietly, like a scar that finally stopped bleeding. And from then on, whenever Lamont appeared on television, in print, In the distant background of a protest crowd, he never smiled widely. He never shouted. He never raised a fist. But his presence shifted the air like a weather front, because now everyone knew what it meant when a man didn't stand and still towered. He didn't return with cameras or reporters. He didn't announce it, didn't mark the day on any public calendar. The gate to the veteran cemetery creaked open with the wind, not ceremony, and the only sound that followed was the crunch of gravel under his boots. Colton walked as if the silence were a road he'd known all his life, past rows of headstones carved with names, dates, ranks, and, more often than not, forgetfulness. The sky was flat, the clouds low, like they didn't want to look down. He reached the grave of Lamont. The dirt had settled, but the pain hadn't. The government hadn't sent a medal. They had sent a letter instead, filled with hollow condolences, sterilized by formality. It was signed, but not felt. The kind of letter written by hands that never held a weapon, hearts that never skipped a beat for the sound of gunfire. Colton didn't bring flowers. He brought a piece of iron, rusted and cold. It wasn't a decoration. It wasn't for display. It was a jagged rod, scavenged from the frame of an old training ground barracks, one Lamont had once repaired by hand, back when the war hadn't taken his legs and the country hadn't turned its back. He drove the rod into the earth at the head of the grave like a marker forged in fury. Then, from his coat, he pulled a blade, not ceremonial, not polished, just a dull combat knife, same one he'd kept in his boot since Desert Storm. He didn't ask for permission. He knelt beside the rod, carved into it slowly, letting each stroke cut through steel like he was speaking in pain. When he was done, the words stood firm. He bled for it. No one takes it back. He stood up, stared at what he had written. It wasn't eloquent, it wasn't poetic, but it was real. More real than any ribbon. More real than any citation read by someone who'd never faced down a bullet. Someone passing nearby, another veteran, limping with the help of a cane, watched from a distance. He didn't speak, just lowered his head and saluted. That was all. A week later, someone snapped a photo of the rod and its carving. The image spread. It didn't carry hashtags. It didn't need filters. Just steel against soil, blood against bureaucracy. Then something unexpected happened. In Ohio, a family visited a grave marked Unknown Soldier and brought their own rod. They carved a name on it. Not of a relative, but of a man their grandfather served with, one who died and never been acknowledged. They wrote, "He was there. We remember." In Arizona, a woman placed a rusted wrench at her brother's grave. He'd been dishonorably discharged for refusing an order that would have cost civilian lives. His case was never reopened. She wrote on the wrench, "His honor outlives your records." In Maine, a group of veterans gathered silently and walked among rows of blank or faded stones. They didn't chant. They didn't shout, they just knelt, pulled out tools, and left behind names, initials, dates, whatever they could remember. Memory is not consent, one wrote. It's rebellion. Colton didn't claim credit. He gave no interviews. When asked by a journalist about the carvings happening nationwide, he simply said, "They're not carving monuments. They're correcting omissions." The Department of Defense was not prepared. Neither were the cemeteries. Complaints came in from officials, unregistered markers, unapproved modifications, defacement of federal land. The backlash was swift, but the public wasn't on their side this time. A petition titled, "Honor Without Permission," hit 2 million signatures in 4 days. Its demand was simple. If the government wouldn't give proper recognition, then the people would, by any means necessary. The White House released a statement, carefully worded, half apology, half deflection. "We understand the pain of our veterans and are reviewing protocols regarding the recognition of service." It was cold, predictable, meaningless. In response, Colton sent back his last awarded medal, not in anger, but in clarity. With it came a letter, written in black ink on brown field paper, the kind that didn't crease easily, the kind you wrote final letters home on. It read, "You don't get to decide who matters, not anymore. If their blood was enough to buy freedom, it should damn well be enough to buy remembrance." He didn't sign it. He stamped it with his thumb, dipped it in dirt. One network printed the letter, unedited, full page. That Sunday, churches read it from the pulpit. Veterans' bars framed it. School teachers taped it to chalkboards. Kids memorized it the way they used to memorize speeches about presidents. This time, it was about soldiers who had no biographies, only bullets. In the months that followed, a new kind of memorial began appearing, not commissioned, not unveiled with ribbon-cutting pomp, but born out of raw necessity. People called them bloodstones. Each was different. Scrap metal welded into rough markers, bricks with initials etched by pocket knives, rusted dog tags bolted onto fence posts. They weren't aligned neatly, they weren't symmetrical, but they were honest. One had the words, "He fell for a country that tried to forget." Another, "We remember who they were, even if you don't." One simply read, "Lamont." And the most haunting, name denied, dignity not. There was no turning back. The wave had begun with a rod and a knife, but it had become something ungovernable. Not vandalism, not protest, restoration, in its rawest form. Colton never spoke publicly again about it, but he continued his visits, always alone, always silent. Sometimes he brought a rod, sometimes a stone, always with words carved, never painted. He once told a fellow veteran, off record, "This country doesn't need more speeches. It needs scars that scream, where mouths were kept shut." The man nodded, then asked, "What happens when all the names are carved?" Colton replied, "Then we start carving questions, ones they can't ignore." The dawn broke like it always did, slow, indifferent, casting a pale gold across the rooftops of Franklin like it had done for centuries, as if nothing remarkable had ever happened here and never would. But that morning, the streets began to pulse with footsteps before the city even opened its eyes. There were no banners, no announcers, no confetti or drums, just a silence thick enough to hear your history breathing. At exactly 7:03 a.m., the courthouse square stood still as a single figure turned onto the avenue from the northern edge of town. Colton, his posture as straight as steel, his steps deliberate, steady, slow, not the march of a man seeking fanfare, but the return of a presence impossible to ignore. He wore the same weathered uniform, polished boots, the chest without decoration, but in his left hand, tightly folded and pressed like a promise, was a triangle of deep navy and red, the flag that had once draped over Lamont's knees in a hospital bed, the one folded and handed to no family because no one had claimed Lamont's service. Now it was Colton's to carry, and carry it he did, not like a symbol, not like a protest, but like memory shaped into fabric, sorrow stitched into geometry. The crowd grew along the sidewalks, not packed, not chanting, just observing, pulled by a gravity no one could name. Veterans stood with their hands on their hearts. Mothers clutched their children closer without knowing why. One man whispered, "He's going back to the place," and no one needed to ask what that meant. He was going up the stairs, the same courthouse steps where he'd once knelt in pain, blood dripping onto the stone, crushed not by violence alone but by the insult of erasure. The same cold granite that had once held his broken pride now waited for him, still bearing the faint discoloration where his blood had dried, scrubbed clean but never forgotten. Colton reached the base. He did not ascend. He stood at the bottom step, lifted the flag slowly, no trembling, no hesitation, and placed it carefully on the edge of the first riser, where the words, "Equal justice under law," had been chiseled so long ago that the letters looked like relics from a world that no longer believed its promises. The flag rested there, quiet, still, perfectly squared. Colton stepped back, then he saluted. No words, no cameras allowed, no microphones had been invited. Just 60 seconds of silence that felt like thunder held in glass. Someone in the crowd tried to raise a phone. A child tugged their sleeve and whispered, "No, don't. He's not doing this for views." The phone dropped. Eyes watched, and time suspended. After exactly 1 minute, Colton turned. He didn't glance back. He didn't wait for applause. He didn't explain. He walked away, leaving behind a folded flag on cold stone, a question in the air, heavier than any verdict. Within an hour, someone posted a grainy image, not of Colton, but of the flag alone on the step, the morning light touching it like a reverent hand. The caption read, "He didn't need to speak." The flag said everything. By afternoon, national news ran the photo under a single headline, "The most expensive silence of the year." People argued over what it meant. Was it a protest? Was it a ceremony? Was it an indictment or an elegy? Pundits filled time slots debating the meaning of a minute. But Colton didn't respond. He wasn't at home. He wasn't in any office. He'd returned to a base no one had known he'd once trained at, where the walls still remembered his footsteps, and the grounds still bore the grooves of his drills. He sat alone in a chapel that hadn't held a service in years. One of the chaplains found him. "You left something behind," he said, offering a photo clipped from a newspaper. Colton shook his head. "That wasn't mine to keep." The chaplain smiled gently. "No, General, but it was yours to return." Outside, a young soldier placed her own folded flag on a courthouse step in Montana, then another in Georgia, then another in New Mexico. No slogans, no hashtags, just folded flags appearing on steps, city by city, silent acknowledgments of something bigger than outrage, something older than protest. A grief was finally allowed to stand upright. Back in Franklin, the original flag remained untouched for 3 days. No one dared move it. On the 4th day, a janitor, moved by instinct rather than instruction, placed a clear plexiglass dome over it, not to seal it away, but to protect it from the rain forecasted that evening. Someone left a note beneath the dome. It read, "If honor can be folded, so can shame. Today only one came to rest here." By the end of the week, city councils across 5 states debated resolutions to mark Day of the Folded Flag. But Colton didn't attend any ceremonies. He declined every interview. When one reporter managed to find him in a diner, eating quietly near a window, she asked, "Do you think your silence is enough?" He looked out the window at a flag fluttering from the roof across the street and said, "Silence is what fills the room after history slams the door." Then he went back to his coffee. No more was needed. The flag had barely settled on the courthouse steps when Capitol Hill summoned its silence into sound. Colton, once the image of restraint and measured defiance, now walked into the congressional hall not as a man beneath scrutiny, but as a measure of it. The rotunda lights bore down on the polished wood, like truth waiting to be spoken. Reporters, advisors, secretaries with notepads already half filled, every eye followed the slow, deliberate pace of a man who refused the crutch of spectacle. He wore the same uniform, faded and pressed not by iron but by memory. He entered with no entourage. No medal glinted from his chest, only silence and the glint in his gaze preceded him. Chairs lined the chamber. Colton did not glance at them. He walked past the front table, stood where the microphone waited, and remained upright, spine drawn like steel from the fire. The room was noticed, not just his stance, but the fact that he made no effort to adjust the microphone to his height. He would not lower himself to the podium. They would rise to hear him. For hours, questions came from both aisles, policy, precedent, and procedural inertia. But Colton did not sit. The sweat on some brows wasn't from heat, but from the quiet refusal of this man to break form. A senator cleared her throat, shifting in her seat as if the ground beneath her had become unstable. "General Colton," she began, formal but edged, "this body thanks you for appearing voluntarily, but it has been hours." "There's a chair, sir, you may sit." Colton's eyes did not blink. His voice came, calm, unyielding. "I once sat where I wasn't welcome. For that, I was shackled, bloodied, and filmed like an intruder in a house I helped build. Since then, I do not sit before those who still wrestle with what it means to stand." A silence dropped like a stone into water. The murmur behind desks and papers vanished. His words echoed, not in volume, but in consequence. One senator looked down. Another cleared his throat with more guilt than mucus. There was no rebuttal. Colton hadn't accused. He'd testified, not in the past tense, but in posture. He remained there through cross-examinations, theoretical scenarios, and data recitations. At no point did he raise his voice or his hand, but with every second he stood, he became a weight none could ignore. After 4 hours, an aide attempted to bring him water. He declined with a nod. His resolve drank deeper things. One congressman leaned into his microphone. His tone dipped in patronizing warmth. "General, surely this is symbolic, but isn't it unnecessary? You're among allies here." Colton turned to him, not a twitch out of place. "Symbolism matters. So does discomfort. You speak of allies, yet the laws you write still arm the wrong hands. Forgive me if I refuse the comfort of friendly illusion." The chamber shifted, not politically, physically. People adjusted in their chairs, unsure whether the cushion beneath them still held dignity or just delay. Colton's presence had become a quiet indictment, not of individuals, but of institutions that taught their furniture to feel entitled. And still, he stood. In the overflow room, where staffers watched on screen, someone whispered, "He's still not sitting?" Another replied, reverently, "He won't. He's rewriting what it means to take a stand without moving." A page handed a note to the stenographer. "Mark the statement," it read, referring to Colton's earlier words. Later that week, those 16 words were carved onto a steel plate fixed outside the Capitol's east wing, facing the public steps. "I do not sit before those who still wrestle with what it means to stand." The hearing adjourned, not with a gavel, but with a breath held too long. Finally exhaled. Colton turned, nodded once to the room, and walked out as he had entered, alone, upright, and unshaken. The chair, left untouched behind him, stayed there longer than any closing statement. It wasn't just empty, it was irrelevant. When Colton exited the chamber, he didn't look back. He never did. But behind him, a room designed for legislative combat had been reduced to quiet reflection. Reporters outside, starved for comment, were left clutching empty microphones as the man passed through marble halls with nothing but the echo of his footsteps to accompany him. There were no statements, no spins, just the undeniable weight of what had happened. Inside the Capitol, a chair remained untouched, and it was now more famous than the ones occupied by power. Within hours, images from the hearing spread like a controlled fire, not the blaze of scandal, but the slow burn of reverence. Screens everywhere looped that still frame. Colton, unmoved, upright, stoic under scrutiny. Hashtags began forming without prompting. No seat given. The man stood still and stand for justice. Commentary ranged from awe to political anxiety. What disturbed many wasn't what Colton said. It was that he didn't need to say much at all. By the end of the day, a dozen editorials appeared. One read, "In a town full of people scrambling to be heard, Colton forced everyone to listen by doing nothing but standing." Another declared, "The only man who brought silence into Congress and made it roar." But it wasn't just media. The message was leaking into schools, homes, and barracks. Civilians discussed it in grocery store lines. Veterans saluted a TV screen. Cadets at the academy stood for 10 full minutes before training. Colton had turned a gesture into doctrine. Meanwhile, in rooms where law was shaped by those long trained in avoidance, discomfort began to crystallize into recognition. Behind closed doors, some grumbled. "He's showboating," one senator muttered, though the edge in his voice betrayed more fear than disdain. Another warned, "He's not here to grandstand. He's here to remind us what we've ignored." And yet Colton wasn't campaigning. He wasn't writing memoirs or courting the media. He wasn't seeking power. He was provoking conscience. In the following days, the chair he refused to sit in was encased in glass and moved to the Capitol Visitor Center. A brass plaque read, "Unused, unyielded, unnecessary." But the true impact revealed itself days later when legislation titled the Veterans Recognition and Oversight Reform Act, reached the floor with bipartisan signatures attached. Quiet ones. Colton's name wasn't among them. He hadn't asked for it, but every page carried the invisible weight of a man who didn't need to raise his hand to hold up a mirror. One morning, a janitor cleaning the chamber found a small note tucked under the table where Colton had stood. It wasn't signed, just written in strong, clear script. A man can sit with medals or stand without them. I chose the harder comfort. The note was later framed, not by the government, but by the cleaning staff, who placed it above their break-room sink. Honor, they said, should start where no one looks for it. In his quiet neighborhood, Colton continued to live in the same one-story home with the crooked mailbox and unmowed lawn. Reporters tried to find patterns in his silence. They failed. A child from next door asked him once, "Why didn't you sit?" Colton smiled and replied, "Because sitting means I'm done, and I'm not." What no one noticed that day was what Colton saw from the window as he walked away from Congress. Not power, not politics, but a single intern standing outside the chamber, straight as a rail, hand over his heart. That, Colton knew, was the echo he wanted. One person choosing to stand, not for spectacle, not for attention, but because something finally made sense. The day after Colton left the Capitol, something subtle shifted in the country's posture, not with parades or press releases, but in how people paused. In courthouses, soldiers who once stood only on command now stood by instinct. In classrooms, history teachers rewrote entire lessons to include not just what was done, but how one man undid silence by refusing a seat. By the end of the week, a low-resolution image, Colton, standing beside the untouched chair, had been turned into street murals, not stylized, not heroic, just still. The kind of still that made you look twice. In Detroit, a homeless veteran whispered through cracked lips, "He stood for us," while staring at one of those walls. In Baton Rouge, a middle school replaced its Hall of Honor banner with Colton's words printed in white over navy. "I do not sit before those who still wrestle with what it means to stand." But it wasn't all reverence. Networks scrambled to recenter the narrative. A senator whose questions had been bypassed during the hearing went on air to say, "I think we're glamorizing obstinacy. It's not how systems change." He was met with calls for resignation within hours. Because Colton hadn't disrespected the system, he had respected it enough to confront its rot. Meanwhile, somewhere behind reinforced glass, the chair Colton never used now drew lines of tourists. People waited not to see a relic, but to witness a void, a refusal made physical. The glass fogged up with breath and reflection. Beside it, a small plaque had been added without ceremony. It read simply, "He came to be questioned, and became the question." The White House, cautious and clever, invited Colton for a photo op. He declined. When asked why, he replied via a one-sentence fax, "My picture was already taken by everyone who needed to see it." On a quiet afternoon, Colton visited a local high school. No announcement, no security. He stood in the back of an auditorium where students were rehearsing a performance titled "A Seat Left Empty." The young lead, a black girl no older than 16, ended her monologue by standing next to a wooden chair center stage and whispering, "Some chairs are waiting for those who never will." Colton didn't speak. He just nodded. The teacher later said that nod said more than any standing ovation ever could. In Congress, whispers turned into pressure. A movement emerged. Informal, uncoordinated, but undeniable. Junior staffers began standing for the entirety of the bill readings, not in protest, in principle. The phrase "no seat, no silence" appeared on post-it notes, on badges, in graffiti, an unspoken tribute to the man who reminded them what gravity felt like in a room too long, weightless with procedure. Colton never claimed victory. He never used the word. When asked by a community organizer during a veteran town hall what his legacy would be, he answered with the quiet steel that had become his hallmark. "Legacies are for those who finish. I'm still standing." And perhaps that was the real shift. No final word, no closing argument. just posture, just presence, just a man with his back straight enough to hold the history that others tried to forget. Colton's image never went viral in the traditional sense. No 10-sec TikTok loop could capture the gravity of a man who changed history by doing less, not more. No trending audio could echo the sound of his silence. Instead, his presence permeated the slowest spaces, library corridors, memorial halls, midnight news segments where tired anchors suddenly sat straighter than usual. He became not a celebrity, but a principle, a question carved into the bones of every building that once looked the other way. Weeks after the hearing, a minor amendment to the Police Review Accountability Act made its way through the committee. It bore no signature from Colton, no lobbying stamp, but in the margin a congresswoman had scribbled, "Stand like him, think like us." That's the balance. That amendment passed unanimously. No applause followed. Just a pause, a small collective inhale, like the country itself adjusting its posture. In Franklin County, where Colton first fell on courthouse steps, that very location became a pilgrimage site, not for tourists, for the forgotten. Veterans in wheelchairs wheeled themselves up just to sit where Colton once bled. Youth groups came not to protest but to listen. Teachers from underfunded schools brought students to the granite etching that now curved into the stairs. This was not a fall. This was a refusal to lie down. Colton did not return. He never needed to. His shadow was etched deeper than any return could reaffirm. He kept walking elsewhere, quietly, consistently, and always on his terms. He refused interviews, turned down book deals, and even declined a biopic proposed by a streaming giant. "I didn't stand for story rights," he told them. "I stood because I had to." The chair he left behind, encased, revered, undisturbed, became the new threshold for dignity. Foreign dignitaries visiting the Capitol were taken past it not to admire but to reflect. When one ambassador asked what it symbolized, the guide responded, "It's not what he sat in, it's what he didn't need." Back home, Colton sat only twice a day, once to tie his boots, to take them off. Every other moment was his form of remembrance. Standing, for him, had transcended the physical. It had become a creed. On Sundays, he stood at the back of local churches, not to draw attention, but to hold space. During the funerals of unknown soldiers, he stood even in the rain. When asked if he ever grew tired, he answered softly, "Fatigue is a small price for the kind of rest others never earn." In a quiet interview released posthumously from a conversation he had recorded privately years before, Colton said, "They thought silence was surrender. I knew it could be a siege." He was never called a martyr. He didn't need to be. He stood, and the nation remembered how. The hearing ended, but its silence kept ringing. It wasn't volume that marked Colton's legacy. It was the clarity he left behind, like footsteps through freshly laid concrete. And so, weeks later, when the Pentagon's southern wing unveiled a monolithic wall of black stone, not everyone understood at first. There were no speeches, no marching bands, no televised countdown or political handshakes, just the wall and the names. Etched with precision, the stone bore a truth the nation had spent decades avoiding. Names of soldiers who never received medals, citations, or commendations, not because they lacked valor, but because they were forgotten, overlooked, inconvenient. These were the men who bled in the wrong zip code, died under unverified reports, or simply had no one left to ask why they were never honored. The names ran edge to edge, unalphabetized, unranked, democratic in death, unranked and democratic in death, and ranked and democratic in death, and ranked and democratic in death. Colton never arrived for the unveiling. He had initiated the project, but, true to form, chose absence over applause. Instead, a simple glass case stood beside the granite, housing a single folded note written in his steady hand. "No one lives forever by rank, only by the names they leave behind in stone." The note had no title, no signature, but no one asked who wrote it. They already knew. People whispered in line to see it, not because they were told it mattered, but because they could feel it did. And just above the letter, etched into the first row of names, a subtle pattern emerged. Lamont. No last name, no decoration, just Lamont. The name now carried like a secret oath between strangers. Families who had never received closure began tracing names with trembling fingers. Some wept. Others stood too stunned to cry. Children who had never met the uncles or grandfathers etched before them suddenly pressed their palms to the stone, as if willing time to turn backward. Even the stone seemed to listen. Reporters searched for statements. None were issued. The Department of Defense provided only a single press bulletin with no quotes, no photos, and only the location and hours of access. What spoke loudest was the crowd. Day after day, the line to view the wall grew longer. No headlines could summarize what those names meant. No historian could footnote the ache now chiseled into national memory. One evening, a young Marine left his cap at the base of the wall. Another left a bronze star. Then came dog tags, folded letters, and medals no longer needed to affirm worth. The stone began to collect stories without speaking. It didn't need to explain itself. Like Colton, it simply existed, undeniable, unmovable. A week after the unveiling, a custodian at the Pentagon noticed something odd. In the early mornings, before sunrise, a man would sometimes stand near the far end of the wall. Silent, unmoving, always alone. Security cameras confirmed it. Always the same silhouette. Always departing before the sun could find his face. They never confirmed it was Colton, but they never doubted it either. The president offered to award Colton a civilian medal for his contributions. He declined. Honor, he responded, isn't currency. It's proof you still remember who you stood for. Months later, educators from military academies began bringing cadets to the wall as part of orientation, not to explain tactics or ranks, but to teach remembrance. One instructor knelt beside a young recruit and said, "These names, they stood for each other. This wall isn't about war. It's about not forgetting who was left behind when peace came late." In New York, a sculptor began carving miniatures of the wall to place in libraries. In Alabama, a choir performed a piece titled The Unnamed Regiment, singing the names aloud for 40 minutes straight without repetition. In Arizona, a community of retired veterans began mailing out nameplates to families whose soldiers never came home. The movement had no headquarters, no slogan, only the wall, and still no word from Colden. The note remained untouched, now laminated behind reinforced glass. Visitors lingered longer in front of that letter than any other feature. Some took photos, some bowed their heads, some just stood, mimicking the very man who had taught them that silence wasn't absence. It was resistance with its mouth closed. In a private journal discovered after his death, Colton had written only one reference to the wall. "A country too proud to weep must first learn to remember. Stone is what you use when words can't carry weight anymore." The wall had no beginning and no end. Like the battles these names fought, it belonged to no one and everyone. And at the heart of it all stood the invisible hand of a man who never claimed credit, never carved his name, but made sure others were finally etched into time. He was never seen there in daylight. He never returned for the ceremony. But somehow, every time someone stood in front of those names, they felt him watching, not judging, not waiting, just making sure they stood long enough to let it matter. The wall stood, silent and eternal, yet not everyone had learned to read the weight of stone. 2 years after the headlines had stopped screaming and the internet had moved on to lighter fare, one figure emerged from the quiet like a ghost, still unwilling to admit it had died. Dana Lasker, former prosecutor, former public servant, former wielder of unchecked authority, walked up the courthouse steps in a suit too tailored for humility. She carried not a file but a petition, her petition, a request for the court to expunge her record, clear the charges that had clung to her like the very echoes she had once cast upon others. The process was routine, her expectation procedure. Inside the modest courtroom, far from federal marble and televised glare, wooden benches creaked under the weight of a few curious citizens, a clerk, a bailiff, and one name no one expected to see again, Lamont. No longer bound by wheels or whispers, Lamont sat elevated, not in vengeance, but in validation. He bore no uniform now, only a charcoal gray suit that fit like it had been earned, not tailored. At his side sat a brass nameplate, Lamont Briggs, State Human Rights Council. It gleamed not from polish, but from the reflection of every person who had once looked down on him and now had to look up. Lasker stepped forward, her legal representative doing the speaking. Words like unjust scrutiny, career interruption, and rehabilitative merit were laid out like bandages, hoping to cover a gash left to rot for too long. The judge turned to Lamont, now serving as senior advisor in the tribunal process. He didn't speak, not yet. The presiding officer asked the required question, the one that held more power than any closing argument. Do you believe your actions, Ms. Lasker, were in error? Silence. The court did not demand volume. It demanded conviction, but all it received was quiet, a cold, sharp-edged silence, not from reflection, but resistance. Lasker's eyes didn't lower. Her spine didn't curve. The arrogance hadn't been erased, only archived. The room waited. Seconds lengthened. Still nothing. Lamont exhaled, softly, audibly. Then he leaned forward, not in anger, but in judgment that carried no malice, only memory. His voice was measured, weighty, without force. I'm not waiting for you to speak. I'm waiting for you to understand. Lasker flinched, but not outwardly. It was in her brow, in the subtle tightening of her jaw. The courtroom held still as if frozen by the simplicity of his sentence. It was not revenge, it was reckoning. No dramatic gestures followed. No gavel thundered through the chamber like divine retribution. The denial was typed, stamped, and passed down the bench with quiet authority. The motion to expunge was rejected. Lasker turned to leave, not escorted, not jeered, just watched. The woman who once made others kneel now walked out of a building where not a single seat had been offered to her. Outside, cameras flashed. Not for her, for Lamont, who exited 5 minutes later, was greeted not by cheers but by solemn nods, acknowledgments from those who now saw him as something more than a man who had once been broken. They saw the man who had held a system in his palm and chose not to crush it, but reshape it. Reporters asked, "Will there be an appeal?" Lamont didn't answer. He simply adjusted the cuffs of his jacket and stepped into the daylight. That afternoon, someone posted a photo of the court transcript with a single quote highlighted in red. "I'm not waiting for you to speak. I'm waiting for you to understand." Within hours, it began trending across social media, attached to images of injustice, policy reform, and even silent protests staged by students. No speeches. Just the quote, just the stare that came with it. In a quiet corner of the Capitol, a senator known for his opposition to criminal justice reform paused beneath the newly installed wall. He read the names again, slower this time. Then he checked his phone, stared at the quote again, and deleted a tweet he'd prepared earlier that morning. The world didn't erupt in fire or confetti. It simply shifted, 1 inch closer to knowing what justice looked like when it wore no uniform, held no gavel, and asked no favors. Only clarity. Lamont never mentioned Lasker again. She had been given her chance. She hadn't taken it, not because she couldn't, but because she still thought kneeling was weakness and silence meant defeat. But in that courtroom, in that minute of immobility, she learned what Colton once taught a nation. You don't have to raise your voice to make others lower theirs. You just have to never kneel when you're right. The courtroom fell silent long after Lamont's words echoed into the public record. But that silence did not remain idle. It migrated into conversations, editorials, and then into the pages of one particular article that detonated across the nation, with no sirens, only truth. Titled, "Where Does Honor Live?" the piece emerged on the front page of the Sunday edition of the New American Ledger, the same newspaper that had once published Colton's arrest photo without context. This time, The ink held something else: reckoning. The feature opened not with Colton's name nor Lamont's, but with a paragraph of haunting statistics. Over 200 cases of veterans denied recognition, not fallen in war but erased in paperwork, names scrubbed, benefits withheld, commendations shelved. Most were men and women of color. Many had no families left to fight for what they had earned. The system hadn't failed them loudly, it had forgotten them quietly. The author, a military historian turned investigative journalist named Richard Miles, had spent over a year compiling the stories. Some were buried in dusty basement archives of decommissioned military hospitals. Others came from whisper-thin letters sent anonymously by clerks who could no longer carry the guilt. In one case, a man named Alfred Jones had been court-martialed for insubordination after refusing to hand over a wounded fellow soldier to a commander who had left him behind. No records remained of that commendation request, only a canceled envelope addressed to his mother, stamped "Return to sender, deceased." But it wasn't until halfway through the article that the names stopped being numbers and started becoming reflections. The turning point was simple. It was Colton. Miles wrote, "A nation that teaches its children to salute must also teach them who we failed to salute in time. If a man like Marcus Colton can stand for a Lamont, then how many Coltons would we need to hold up the weight of 200 silent names?" The question hung like a challenge, not just to policymakers, but to citizens who had long clapped at parades while ignoring the gaps in the march. Within 48 hours, the piece had been reprinted, translated, and debated. 5 major military academies, West Point among them, announced they were integrating the full article into their mandatory ethics curriculum. The decision was met with controversy, then reluctant admiration. "It teaches uncomfortable truths," one general stated, and that's precisely why it's required. The article did not paint Colton as a saint. It never claimed Lamont had single-handedly changed the system. What it did was draw a map from silence to consequence. One name, one refusal, one courtroom, one folded flag at a time. At the end of the article, a final paragraph broke convention. No journalistic detachment, no academic language. Just this. They told us honor comes in bars and stars, but honor is not manufactured. It's inherited through courage and passed down by memory. If we forget those who are never named, then we don't deserve the names we do remember. That quote, handwritten on a chalkboard by a military instructor at Quantico, was photographed and posted online. The image went viral in less than an hour. Soon, volunteers began compiling an open-access memorial database of unrecognized veterans. Families submitted photos, dates, and last-known units. Some had nothing but nicknames. A grandmother in Mississippi mailed a pair of army boots with the note, "My boy never made it home, but maybe now his name will." His name was entered under Private First Class Eli Red Thompson. Status, finally seen. Back in Franklin County, where Colton had once stood at the foot of the courthouse steps with Lamont's flag, a mural began to take shape on the wall of the local community center. It featured silhouettes, not of famous generals or marble monuments, but of unnamed soldiers lifting others on their shoulders, faceless, but not forgotten. Below it, painted in bold black script, were the words from Miles' article. "How many Coltons does it take to keep our honor from falling?" And beneath that, in smaller letters, one. "But he must stand, always." Colton never responded to the article publicly, but a week after it ran, a plain envelope arrived at the New American Ledger office. Inside was a single photo, Colton in front of the Pentagon wall, his hand touching the stone. On the back was a note. "Truth doesn't need defense, it needs daylight." No signature, none was needed. The article still echoed in briefing rooms and lecture halls when the City Council of Franklin received an anonymous proposal to erect a statue, not for Colton, not for Lamont, not for any individual, but for what they represented. No signature accompanied the blueprint, just a pencil sketch of a lone figure standing upright between 2 towering walls. No face, No plaque of honor, just posture. Weeks later, the foundation was poured in silence. No press release, no ribbon-cutting ceremony. It rose slowly in the courtyard of the Regional Justice Complex between the old courthouse where Colton had once been thrown down and the new hall where Lamont had returned upright. Stone by stone it took shape. A soldier, upright, not saluting, not kneeling. His hands were at his sides, his back is straight, his chin slightly lifted, not in defiance but in memory. When the veil was finally pulled away, no name was carved, no military branch, no battle listed, just form, timeless and still, cast in dark bronze that reflected both the morning and the dusk, depending on when you stood before it. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't need to. Some removed their hats, others lowered their phones, but no one asked who it was. They already knew. The press called it the last stand. Locals named it something else, the one who stood for us. But the name that stuck, the one spoken most often in reverent tones, was simple: the stand-in. The man who stood in place of those erased, those buried without acknowledgement, those stripped of honor but not of courage. A small plaque rested to the right, no bigger than a book cover. On it, a single sentence, etched into black granite with such restraint it felt whispered rather than chiseled. We survive on those who knew when silence meant more than speech. Tourists came, not in droves but in quiet twos and threes. Veterans passed by and stopped mid-stride. Some saluted, some didn't. All understood. No guard protected it. None was needed. The statue did not beg for reverence. It commanded it, without posture, without permission. No one could prove it was Colton. No record linked his name. The city denied any official dedication, but every janitor, every clerk, every passing pedestrian knew it was him, not in likeness, but in truth. The weight of his silence, the gravity of his stance, had birthed a figure too universal to be anyone else, and yet too singular to be anyone else but him. On a Sunday morning, months after the unveiling, a young cadet brought his little sister to see the monument. She tilted her head, puzzled. "Why doesn't it have a name?" she asked. The cadet knelt beside her, eyes never leaving the figure. "Because sometimes," he said, "names are too small." That evening, someone left a folded flag beneath the statue. Not pristine, not ceremonial, weathered, worn, probably passed through too many hands to count. No note, just fabric. The next day it was gone. Not stolen, just no longer needed there. The monument remained. He passed without announcement, without ceremony, without the weight of legacy dragging behind. General Marcus Elijah Colton, the man who had stood when the system sat on truth, slipped into death as he had moved through history, with quiet insistence. No flashing alert broke into prime time. No military salute echoed through the chambers. He died in his sleep, alone, in the same modest home where his boots always faced the door, never polished, always ready. There was no funeral, no flag-covered casket, no rifles fired into the sky. But by midday, word reached places no broadcast could touch. One by one, checkpoints at military bases lowered their flags without instruction. Marines paused mid-drill, Army clerks froze mid-keystroke, naval personnel stood facing east for no protocoled reason. No command was given, and yet from Alaska to Guam every uniformed hand dropped what it held and came to rest by the thigh. Posture perfect, silence complete. The Department of Defense issued a single-line bulletin, stamped in black, not gold. He never asked us to speak. Today we only understand by staying silent. No image accompanied the statement. None was needed. That night, across the country, stadiums brimmed for regular games. Football, baseball, and college matches lost in weekend noise. But before kickoff, each loudspeaker paused. The national anthem played. Not shouted, not performed, just allowed to unfold. And for the first time in decades, no one in the crowd sang along. No hands over hearts, no cheers at the final note, only the weight of reverence suspended in air. In the Oval Office, the president stepped before cameras. No entourage, no flag behind her moved. She looked directly into the lens, eyes steady. "We often told ourselves that silence was cowardice," she said. "We believed action had to be loud to be meaningful. But then came a man who refused to sit, refused to shout, refused to claim revenge. Without him, we might still mistake restraint for weakness. Because of him, we now understand some truths need no defense. Some men don't demand respect, they leave us no other option. That was all." Back in Franklin County, someone placed an old pair of combat boots beneath the nameless monument. No message, no flowers, only the laces tied tightly, deliberately, still standing upright. And still, no one cried. They stood, because that's what you do for someone who never stopped standing, even when the world gave him every reason to fall.